Évidemment. We meet in a bar, and then the 20-strong flotilla sets out into the strong tides and deep waters of the Rance estuary. We lower our sails just before we reach the tidal barrier and drift around, chatting and waiting for the sea lock to open, which is going to allow us up into the waters above the tidal power station. Above the barrier, the Rance becomes effectively a large and beautiful lake with gentle tides, and we drift up it with a following wind. 20 small boats, here to prove that you don't need a large and ostentatious vessel to have a stimulating and fascinating time sailing along the coast. I'm sometimes asked if there is anything like the Dinghy Cruising Association here in France. Is there an organisation that sets up rallies where little boats sail along the coast, people sleep aboard under canvas, that sort of thing? And no, there isn't really. There is a very potent small boat movement in France, particularly the Voile Avion movement. But the French have a different attitude to these things, I rather think. But I have, for a number of years, been participating in something called the Challenge Naviguer Léger, which is very much the same sort of thing. But as I often say, it is interesting that the French make it into a challenge, a challenge. It isn't simply a cruise, it is challenging. And I have here collected together a number of little pieces of film about the last couple of years of the challenge, which I think will be interesting to you. This event is inspired by Le Chasse-Marée, a truly remarkable publishing house based in Douarnenez. Since the 1980s, they have been producing a series of beautiful magazines about history, about places along the coastline, about fishing, about traditional boats, but in particular about sailing outrement, about sailing differently. They have promoted in particular sail and oar boats, the Voile Aviron movement. Simple boats, straightforward, easy to sail and deeply satisfying. That's Gwendal Jaffrey, the current editor. Many of these boat designs were first published in Le Chasse-Marée. In particular, these two Illours, both designed by François Vivier. But there are more conventional modern dinghies too, like this Wayfarer. And this event was organised by Le Chasse-Marée, and it is called the Challenge Naviguer Léger. And the idea is that we sail together for 4 days en autonomie totale, without reliance upon the shore for food or accommodation. Instead, we carry all that gear aboard with us and camp either aboard our boats or on the shore beside them every night. The two boats in the foreground here are Skerries from Arwen Marine. Here are the other two Illours again, sister ships of my boat, but one of them with a different rig. Emmanuel's boat, passing under the suspension bridge here, is François Vivier's alternative sloop rig with a balanced lug sail. Eventually the Rance estuary narrows and becomes a tidal creek, which leads to another lock with a swing bridge that opens for us and lets us through into the River Rance navigation. This leads into the French canal system and gives access to Rennes and Lorient and Nantes, but we sail only as far as the medieval city of Dinan. This boat here, being sculled over the stern, is another Francois Vivier design, a sail designed originally for sailing on the river Loire and its tributaries. In Dinan we moor against the quayside on the river and stop for a brief apéro, or a drink, before we finally drop back down the river to find somewhere to stop for the night. The following morning we carry on down the river, down into the Rance estuary, and then sail all the way down the Rance estuary and lock out of the tidal barrier. The plan then is to sail along the coast through the belt of rocks that surrounds Saint-Malo, straight into the easterly wind, and along through a narrow passage south of the Ile Bénéteau, and then to the Havre Rotteneuf, where we intend to spend the night. But it is a hard, wet beat to windward, and in the end only 5 boats get to the Havre. 3 Allures, Gwendal's blue boat, and the Wayfarer, which in fact got there first. For a long time there were only 4 of us there, and we thought that Emmanuel in the 3rd Allure had turned back as well. But finally he arrives and sails smartly into the bay and passes behind the other boats bobbing around on their moorings. Here he passes in front of the entrance to the Havre Rotteneuf, and you can see that the entrance is still dry and all the boats inside are still dried out on the sand. Emmanuel sails close behind the stern of my boat, grabs his boat hook and coolly turns into the wind and picks up a mooring close alongside my dinghy. Once the tide has risen high enough to enter the Havre, we moor our boats close inshore and have a picnic on the beach. Challonges had been planned to give us high tides in the evening so that we could lie dried out overnight and then float off in the morning when the tide came in again. The Wayfarer crew camped ashore in a little tent, and so they rolled their boat well up the beach. We then sail out of the Havre Rotteneuf into a fairly lumpy sea, but much less so than it had been the day before. By this stage it had become plain that there were 2 types of boats in the Challonges. There were boats very much orientated towards sailing that were happy in a lumpy sea, beamy boats with wide, capacious hulls and high topsides. And then there were the boats that were much better under oars and far better when rowing up and down the narrow rivers in sheltered water.
Oui.
Pour toi, il manque beaucoup d'eau pour passer?
Je ne sais pas. Je pense Gwendal est plus proche.
J'ai envie d'aller voir un peu plus près en fait.
Ouais.
And so naturally the flotilla began to separate into 2 parties. and the three Ilures and Gwendal's boat ended up sailing a lot of the time in a little group, as we tended to move at the same pace and had the same sort of capability in rough water. Here we are sailing close inshore into shallow water to pass over a sandbar behind a little rocky island. Here's Ava-Rothnurf, where we set off from. We sailed all the way along the coast past St. Malo and into this bay here. Now we're going to sail through between the rocks and through this little passage here and up to the Ile des Ebbiennes. And then finally, when the tide has risen high enough for us to pass across the sandbar, we join the others on the Ile des Ebbiennes for a party on the beach once again. So all that remains to be done the next morning is to sail back along the coast to St. Malo. Here is Gilles Montauban's own design. A very interesting boat and very fast under sail and under oar. Once again the three Ilures ended up sailing along together, but this time we were joined by the sail, moving very well in the calm conditions. The wind dropped away entirely long before we got back to St. Malo, and it was very noticeable that it was the rowing-oriented boats that got back for lunch long before the beamy sailing boats like mine. The 2019 challenge is in the Bay of Quiberon in South Brittany, and this time I am joined by Mary Dooley, who has decided to abandon her little mirror and come along sailing with me for once. This time there is an even wider selection of boats, including an adapted Hobie Cat. Here we are entering Pénerf at the end of our first day's passage from Piriac-sur-Mer. Once again the wayfarer was there, being annoyingly fast under sail, as usual. We beached our boats on the sandbar just at the entrance to Pénerf. Some people pulled their boats up on the beach and put up tents on the land. Others of us had tents we could put up on our boats, so we spent the night afloat. The next morning's passage was a tough one, into a westerly wind and tacking through the rocks off the entrance to the Gulf de Morbihan. Here's the chart of the Bay of Quiberon, and up here in the top right hand corner is Pénerf. We sailed out of there all the way along the coast, round the Plateau de Saint-Jacques, across the entrance of the Gulf de Morbihan, through the rocks and into La Trinité just over here. So when we arrived on the beach at Carnac-Plage, we discovered that we had once again lost many of the smaller and narrower boats, and all we were left with once again was the heavier and beamier boats. But nonetheless there was still a good crowd that had arrived at Carnac-Plage. The next day's passage is all the way across the Bay of Quiberon from north to south, all the way down to the Isle of Uedic. So we left Carnac Plage, we crossed the Bay of Quiberon rowing a lot of the time, across the top of the Isle of Huat, between the rocks, in between the two islands, and then round the bottom of Uedic and into the little harbour.
Sitting up so I can see the rocks and the water.
Sensible boats moored deep in the harbour like those boats you can see there, but we moored further out, just beyond the end of the breakwater, which proved to be not such a good idea. But in the meantime we explored the beautiful Isle of Uedic. It was Midsummer's Eve, and on Midsummer's Eve all over France you find music. Next morning we discovered the problems with our choice of mooring place. The boat ended up pounding on the sand and wedged up the centreboard. So we decided, instead of beating to windward with the rest of the flotilla up to Piriac, that we would sail off on a broad reach from Uedic to the entrance to the Gulf de Morbihan and instead haul out at Port Navalo. Here Mary gave a demonstration of her skill at sculling Aveldro over the stern.